For many years now, Russ and Craig have had many wide-ranging conversations with folks from all over the gaming world. This is one of those conversations.
D6G, the Lost Chapter.
Well, welcome back to Dunkin' Donuts, and today we're very excited to have with us Drew. Drew, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm really, really good. I'll be better after I have this big cup of coffee. Much needed.
There you go.
Awesome.
There you go.
Awesome. So Drew has been in the gaming industry now for quite some time, an amazing amount of time. And I was fortunate enough to work with Drew briefly when he was at Games Workshop, and I ran a little store that sold Games Workshop stuff.
A little
store.
And I was honored to work with Drew because Drew is the one who brought me into Games Workshop.
Exactly.
And that was a long time ago. And I still remember fondly the Warhammer Fantasy tournament that you dragged me to. That was the opening of all of that.
Yeah, the start of it all.
Yeah,
right,
down at Cape Cod.
So we're all miniature gamers. And now, Drew, do you play a lot of board games also?
I do quite a few board games. I just played a game of Descent, Journey into the Dark.
Second edition?
Just a few nights ago. No, we went back to the
old
first
school.
edition.
Nice.
Old school.
Nice.
That really devolved into just complete and total madness, and people, of course, doing ridiculous things like they always do in board games, role-playing games, and miniature games.
Right. Well, that's part of the fun. And we were talking, Drew, before the show, we're like, what would be a kind of fun thing to talk about? And you brought up this idea that, you kind of noticed that a lot of board games nowadays are sort of starting to become more than just a board game and more of a hobby game. And I guess sort of the lines between a miniature game and a board game are getting kind of blurry. And we thought it'd be kind of fun to chat about that for a little bit. What kind of things were you thinking about when you thought about that idea?
Well, my last painting project actually was Mansions of Madness. I've got 2 sets of Mansions of Madness, and they're just beautiful models. Like, they're great models, and they're so much fun to put together. And there's a lot of other uses for them, not just the Mansions of Madness game. And as I was painting those and working on those models, I started to realize that there's a lot of games out there like that right now.
Right.
And there's more and more coming where you can play these great board games that come with great miniatures that are really, really high quality, great sculpts that really almost beg to be taken off that board that comes with the game and explored somewhere else.
I think you're totally right. And it's funny because when Craig and I, every time we do achievements in gaming, we get to that section, we do a modeling section, we talk about what we've been painting. And I was thinking to myself the other day, about half the time I'm doing parts for board games and not necessarily for miniature games. And I don't feel like it used to be when you painted your board game models, you kind of felt like, okay, well, these aren't really as cool as my miniature models. But nowadays it feels like the quality really is there. I don't know what the magic is now, but are you noticing more and more the line between the quality of a miniature game and a board game is getting blurry in terms of the model sculpts and things?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, I'm going to talk about what I know because I was just painting them. The Mansions of Madness models paint up just as well as most plastic models from other gaming companies. They're great quality miniatures that are, have enough detail on them that they're easy to paint and get you some great results. And I think there's a second thing that happens there, Russ. I think we've become better painters over the years. So we do a little bit better with models that or just your average model that we can do a little bit better results on as well.
That's
I think
true. We can definitely
both things happening.
We can definitely kick them up a notch. And I've noticed that myself. I'll paint models that I think aren't particularly great, but I'm like, I can make these look a little better. But I also noticed, what's interesting is too, and you brought up Mansions of Madness, which is an interesting point because that's from Fantasy Flight Games, which really they're a fantastic board game company, but they really don't do miniature games. Didn't do. Now they are doing them more. but where if you look at like the early examples, I was thinking about this of the games that kind of merge that are mostly early Games Workshop games. You look at like Blood Bowl, Space Hulk,
Dungeon Quest came before both of those.
Right. Those were games that were a miniature company saying, hey, let's make another product and sell more plastic, right? But really, they were great games. I mean, Blood Bowl is one of my favorite board games. but it definitely was a hobby component. But now you have, it's sort of come full circle. Now the board game companies doing the same thing with your great example of, I mean, you could think of like 10 or 15 Fantasy Flight games that all have paintable miniatures, whether it's, we have friends that have painted all the Rune Wars stuff. You've got, as you mentioned, Mansion of Madness. You got Descent. A lot of our friends have painted up the Descent models. The Battlelore games and the Battles of Westeros games. Those are all great models that can be painted. They've done some really great modeling, and the games actually feel like, in many ways, miniature games, especially if you look at like a game like Battlelore.
Yeah, and I think too, you could even go to that extreme. I have a really good friend. He paints all his miniatures for games. Like, you don't ever go to his house and play a board game. Even if you were playing Sorry, he'd have custom Sorry pieces out on the table. And I think some of that comes from us being hobbyists. Like, we really want to tinker with it and paint it and customize it and make us our own. And I think these board game companies have come up with something that they can appeal to those board gamers as well as miniature gamers by putting the two together.
Now, Drew, do you think, like chicken and egg time, do you think that this is board game companies like FFG targeting us?
No, I don't. I think that, sadly, being in the gaming industry for so long, I don't think anybody in the gaming industry is that clever. I think they put together a game that they want to sell. And what happens with that is kind of an evolution. And I don't think anybody at Fantasy Flight Games expected people to buy their boxes and spend hours and hours painting the miniatures. I think they put together great pieces and they were just going to put them out there, and that was what was going to work. And it evolved. It's the way it feels to me that it happened anyway.
I think you're probably right on the Fantasy Flight game side, but I think now there are companies who actively target modeling folks with new model lines, but instead of having to create an entirely new miniature war game, they come at it from a board game point of view. And I think the classic example of the company I'm thinking about head around is Cool Mini or Not.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that with their Super Dungeon Explorer.
These guys are cranking out really high-end miniature games from sculptors we know. I mean, if you look at Super Dungeon Explorer, Zombicide, and what's
Relic
the
Knights?
Sedition Wars. Sedition Wars. They're literally on big banner. Mike McVeigh did all the models here. When you're doing that, you're pretty much targeting the miniature gamer, right? And it's just like an excuse to get those awesome miniatures painted. Oh, look, there's a framework for a board game with it. I mean, I think there was definitely
that's a really good point, because it's not called Cool Board Game or Not. It's called Cool Mini or Not. Yeah, that's a good point.
But they're a good example, and I think this is interesting. I think the explosion of the board game in general, and people finding more time to, or board games being more appealing to people across gamer folks, is this idea that I can sell a board game to miniature gamers if I've got cool miniatures with it. I think that's something that needs to happen. I think before, if you were going to sell miniatures, it had to be a miniature game, it had to be a tabletop game, and now I think it's more along the lines, if I can make a cool board game. If you look at Zombicide, it's a great example where you're really selling some fantastic miniatures. And a lot of people got into Zombicide thinking, I'm just going to get a bunch of zombies cheap, right? $100 I can get 80 zombies. That's dirt cheap for miniatures with that sculpt level, and yet it's also a pretty darn good board game, wrapped around that.
Right, but I mean, to kind of back up Drew's point, FFG making board games with minis, I think, is very different from a brand new company, which I think we can all agree, Cool Mini or Not, is targeting. You know what I mean? It's not a board game company that's like, now we'll make some properties also that'll go. Their sort of target market are those of us who are both mini gamers, but we like board games, so to speak. Yeah. Don't you think? I mean, it's almost like they're seeing like, Fantasy Flight is having a lot of success with this sort of thing. We can go in there with our knowledge of mini games and our knowledge of mini gamers and kind of elbow our way into a niche, giving them exactly what they want, and almost being able to spin it with our experience of years and years and years working with minis and things like that. So it's almost like creating a new niche rather than fitting into an existing one. Yeah. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think you're right, and it is a chicken or an egg kind of debate. That I think there's little bits and pieces of both sides of that, and some people are going to say the chicken came first, and some people are going to say the egg came first. And I think there's a bigger overarch that happens with this, is that we're in a time where geeks kind of rule, and more people are getting exposed to board games, miniature games, video games, and what used to be considered geek culture. That there's an explosion of that, and it allows these companies to succeed. And you can look at Zombicide as a great example of that, where they go on Kickstarter, they put this great zombie game with really, really nice miniatures on Kickstarter, and they raise lots and lots of money. And all that money didn't come from people who already play miniature games or already play board games. It came from a mix of both, and some new people that are just exposed to zombies and really cool, epic, the idea of these things eating your brains, which is just great.
Right. I think... go ahead.
Go ahead, Russ. No, go ahead.
I think one of the things that appeals to me about it, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but one of the biggest challenges, one of the things, the reason a lot of us get into, as a miniature painter, I look at this and I think, I get into miniatures because I love the models. I've said before, rules are important to me, but oftentimes the models will draw me in and I want to paint them. And then you're thinking with a miniature game, you're like, okay, well, now I got to find some friends who are going to buy another army I can fight against, because it's just too expensive to own every army. And then I've got to convince them to paint their models, because now I want to have a beautiful looking game, but I got to go and he's not going to. And then I got to get the terrain right for the game, right? Whereas with these board games, it's like if I just take this one game, like Zombicide, which has 80 models in it, which is the size of like a good sized fantasy army, or a little smaller than that, or a GW army, and then I take that home, I paint that up. I have a fantastic looking game now. I have a fantastic gaming experience that I can share with nobody else to buy anything. And for the time it takes me to paint one army up, I can have a nice gaming experience with all my friends. I can share it, get a lot more play with it. It'll get more table time. I just feel like I don't know. I just feel like it's got a guaranteed more exposure. You still get that warm fuzzy feeling of I made something out of this. I created something with my creatively, right? With my paint jobs, I chose these colors. I did my thing. I made the game my own. I made it look cool. Yet it's easier to get to the table. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think it does, and it made me think about. I have quite a few friends that are really passionate about board games, and they don't paint miniatures. Like they're not tabletop gamers or miniature painters. And I think a game like Zombicide or Mansions of Madness is a great example, is that we got to remember that there's lots of people playing those games with just the game pieces, just like they come, and they're not painting those miniatures.
Right.
And it makes it easier to get into. Like those games are easier to get into when they're not being sold to you with the expectation of you're going to paint these. Like these have to be painted. Here, buy your, do you have paint, glue, and primer with those? Right. It's here's your box. Go have fun playing that game. Oh, you want to paint them? That's great. You know what? We recommend you use these products. Like they'll work really, really good for this. But you can buy a box and you can go home and play a game. So I think it's what you're saying, Russ, but there's another element there where you don't even have to do the hobby part of it. You really could just play these games.
Sure.
They're still a lot of fun.
And I think there's another part to it, too. We have one local example of this. This is just anecdotal, but a friend of ours, Randy, who is a total board gamer. This guy knows, you can mention any board game to him. He knows all about it. He's played everything from Kalis through whatever. He knows his Euros. He knows his Ameritrash. He knows all that stuff. Never painted a model in his life. And we started to do a Descent 2 campaign, and he was like, you know what, I really want to learn how to paint these models. Will you teach me? So we did an afternoon at the store, and he brought our paints in, and we painted, I was telling him about priming and everything. We painted up 2 or 3 models, and he's been cranking out now his monsters for his Descent game, and he's loving it. And he has no interest in miniature war games. He has no interest in War Machine or Games Workshop or Malifaux or any of that stuff. But he's starting to come back, and he starts saying the same things that miniature game. This is just a very relaxing hobby. I really like the feeling I get when I'm done. I didn't realize how you can make stuff look so nice and it's not so hard. It's really easy as you think it's going to be, and he really got into it. And so I think it's another. What's also nice about it, as you mentioned, Drew, is because there's such an easy, there's not this intimidating 80-page rule book you got to absorb, right? And which models do I buy first, and how do I build my army, and how do I figure all that out? It's really, if I buy this one box, I have a game that's designed to be completely playable by itself, and I can learn how to paint these really nice-looking models now. And they're not as intimidating to paint, right? They're They're easier to build many times, and this is what amazes me the most. They're pre-assembled. They're pre-done. There's not even a spruta clip, which is astounding when you think about the price point and what you're getting done, in those boxes.
And how much plastic you threw away in sprues when you're talking about minis games.
Right.
I got this idea forming in my head as you're talking about that, Russ, that there's something really honest about these games. Like they're selling you a game with miniatures, and you get to decide what to do. And in my head, that's equating to some kind of honesty in the box. There's that what you get is what you get, and if you want to do more with it, that's great. Similar to a guy that goes out and buys a Honda Accord, and some guys are just going to drive around in their Honda Accords, and some guys are going to put all kinds of crazy wings on them and make them go sideways.
Right.
It's up to the end user to do what they want to do with it, or mod them, or do what they want. And I think some of the big gaming companies, the tabletop gaming companies, could really, really use a dose of that in thinking about what do we sell, and how do we make sure people really understand what we sell? Are we selling a game, or are we selling a hobby? What is that exactly, and how do we make that message clear? And I think these board games have that message really, really clear. You're buying a board game.
Yeah. Now, where do these games fit in, or are they a totally different thing? Like, I was thinking of, like, Dreadfleet, right? So if you look at something like a Dreadfleet, is that a board game in a box with miniatures? Is it a miniature game in a box and it's not a board? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, is that sort of the same thing we're talking about, where it's self-contained? Is it got that honesty in your head, where it's like everything they're ever going to make for Dreadfleet's in that box? There's no, like, what else do I have to buy? You know what you're going to get. Is that sort of the same thing, but it's in a miniature form factor because there's no grid or anything?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you go through the Dreadfleet rules, they clearly explain how the game is going to be played on a tabletop. They provide that little map that you can use that doesn't actually have a grid, but it's clearly explained. It makes sense in the rules, and it just breaks the tradition of what does the board look like in a board game, which isn't a lot different with the ones that you start thinking about with Super Dungeon Explorer, where you start having tiles that kind of form out from that. It becomes atypical. So yeah, I think it fits the same genre or the same thing. It's a game in a box. Like everything you needed for Dreadfleet was right there. And the only real difference there is again, some assembly is going to require. Like when you got home with your box of Dreadfleet, if you didn't have some plastic glue and you didn't have hobby clippers, you would have been out of luck.
Right. Yep.
You wouldn't have got very far with your Dreadfleet.
Yeah. And go ahead, Drew.
It's not the same with Descent. Like you bring home a box of Descent and you snap the pieces together and you're ready to go.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when I think about Dreadfleet, I have been preparing myself to say that it's not a board game. But then when you mentioned, Drew, the mat, because the mat actually is part of the game with all of the coordinates all around the edge that key right into the game with all the weather and different effects and things like that. So you really do need to play on that mat. That mat's not just there. You could play it on a table or you could play it on this mat. The mat is the board, which does take an active part in the game itself.
I think that if Games Workshop would have called Dreadfleet a board game, I think people would have understood what Dreadfleet was a lot better.
Right.
Probably,
yeah.
And I think my opinion there, like that simple, Dreadfleet was a board game that we tried to confuse with the other really, really great products that Games Workshop sells and tie it into that IP.
Right.
It's a great board game. Like, why can't we just call it it's a great board game?
Right.
Yeah.
It's a great board game.
Yeah.
Right. But I think the confusion that they created also was, just like you said, the quality of the models, which is awesome from a modeler's point of view, but I would have to imagine would be ridiculously frustrating from the point of view of a guy who had just even worked his way through the entire Descent catalog.
Exactly. And I can't remember the buddy of yours names who loves board games, but I picture that guy getting home with his box of Dreadfleet and being really, really frustrated and not really understanding what he bought.
Yeah, and I think. Go ahead.
And again, this isn't about what a company did wrong with a single product. It's about that there's these really, really great products out there, Dreadfleet being one of those, that are board games that come with really, really, really great models. And I think that the miniature and board game world is starting to really, really blur with those two combos. Like, you get them both in one place. Hope we see more of it.
I agree. Hey, does this happen to you guys? I feel like I'm getting spoiled by these games, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So, a friend of ours, and this is sort of a side, but I'm going here. A friend of ours...
You go right ahead.
A friend of ours, who we call Shifty on the show, his name's Will. Will has this tactic where this goes back to my mentioning of the fact that when you buy a board game, I can easily get people to play with me because they have no investment to make, right? I can break that board game out, Zombie Side, it's a 6-player game, I've pinned all the zombies, jump in and play with me, let's share a game together, great. So a friend of mine really wants to get players into Infinity. He loves the universe of Infinity, he likes the models of Infinity, he wants people to play Infinity with him. The rest of us, we think the models are cool, but we're not going to invest into the miniature war game. So his clever tactic was to buy each of us the starter models for Infinity and give them to us. Now, we didn't ask, he just did this one day. So we're like, oh my God, okay, so fine. So, long story short, I'm getting ready to build my Infinity models. So I pop open the stuff. Now, I still build models all the time. I build my War Machine stuff all the time. I'm working on other models too. But I popped open the Infinity and I'm like, oh my God, where's my glue? Where's my files? I got flashing to deal with. They're not, hey, these are nice sculpts. It's like Malifaux too. I love my Malifaux models, but there's a lot of work to do to put these things together. And I'm spoiled because I'm like, I buy Zombie Side. I got great looking models. I don't do anything. I just prime them and paint them. There's no, clipping off the sprue or even filing or trying to get the little antennas in place and holding them 15 minutes with super glue, trying to make sure they stay up. And I'm just like, I'm feeling bad because I'm like, I'm a miniature gamer, darn it. I should be enjoying this. This is part of the fun. And part of me's like, I feel so spoiled. Do you guys get that way with this stuff?
Yeah, I definitely get that way. My least favorite thing in the hobby is building models. I spend lots of my hard-earned money paying people to build my models. That's how much I dislike it.
Oh, really? Wow.
and these great games, Super Dungeon Explorers is my example of that. You get these great models. They're fun. They're zany. They have that anime feel. And you just put them on a base and you're ready to go. Like, you got these fun models to paint and do something with that are just ready to go. I think my prediction is you're going to see more and more of that in the miniature game world as resin starts to dominate that, and as the way that they do injection molding with resin starts to become more and more advanced. You'll just get a kit. Like, it'll just be a single piece model.
I think you're probably right. I was thinking about that too. Privateer, like when I just got my daughter, I mentioned on the main show, I bought my daughter the starter set for the Circle of Orbos Hordes plastics from Privateer, and they do a great job with those because there's no sprues. They're multi-part models, but they all slot together. You glue them together. It's very quick and easy. There's no filing. There's very little flashing. Now, their metal models are still complicated and everything, but that's a nice direction to see their newer kits go that way. And I'd like to see more. I know it's hard when you're a young startup like Infinity or other smaller companies to do that kind of stuff, but I think it's going to be harder and harder for these little companies to keep doing things that way when you've got these Kickstarters coming out there right out of the chute because they're involved with a bunch of veteran gamers like Cool Mini or Not and Mike McVeigh and whoever else is involved, cranking out these amazing models. I mean, if you look at the models from Sedition Wars, they look fantastic. And if they come out, and after getting Zombie Side, getting the results and seeing it pretty much exactly as advertised, if they can pull the same thing off with Sedition Wars and Super Dungeon Explorer and those other games, they're going to be having a track record that's just like, boom, these things look fantastic. And I think it's going to be much, much more hard, I guess, more difficult is the word I'm looking for, for these companies to get this stuff out there and be competitive. Right.
Well, but also with what you're saying about speaking of zombies, I feel like somebody just ate my brain. Privateer Press going with the plastics and they're relatively easy to put together, and you get a really good result. If you look at all the Warhammer 40K and Warhammer Fantasy, the starter box models, you're talking about very easy, very basic, almost board game level simplicity in those models, and they look beautiful, and yet those are that you don't see that expanding through the whole range for that. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, beyond those kits, and in fact, the very models in those kits have versions that are outside of those kits that are those, 5-10 piece models that then go all the different ways. And so it's almost like there's a transition there where they're trying to ease you in, where that like doesn't seem to be a tendency or a trend for the entire industry, rather than a way to get people into the game. And then, now you've got to make a billion of these more complicated ones.
Right.
I think that goes back to, and I think honesty is a really harsh word. I don't mean that anybody's being dishonest, because that's what gets implied by that. It's that Games Workshop sells a hobby that has a game around it.
Yeah.
And I think if that message could be repeated over and over again, and the world could understand that, if you ask people inside of Games Workshop, what do you do? Well, they sell this hobby. They have this great hobby that they sell, and it's amazing. They put out these amazing miniatures with some really, really good rules around it. I think telling people that would be the first step, and really, really helping that. And going back to these board games, that's what you get. You get a board game that says, we're a board game. And again, the end user decides, like, are you just going to put these models on their little bases and move them around the board and enjoy the game? Or are you going to spend time painting it and doing the extra hobby stuff with it? Are you going to customize your pieces and change your pieces around? It's up to that end user and where that goes to, instead of kind of trying to drive somebody there.
Drew, I'm curious to see if, like my friend Randy, who is starting to get into painting, and I'm curious to see if down the road these kind of games become gateways to, I guess, let's broaden the question, I guess. So do we think that if you're a miniature gamer and you see these great miniatures, will it pull miniature gamers more in the direction of board games? Like 10 years ago, I played very few board games, but I was a hardcore miniature gamer. And I don't know, over that time, I don't know if board games have just had a renaissance, or I've just finally figured out they were there, but now I'm wondering, but even then there weren't these cool miniature versions of them now. I'm wondering now, will miniature gamers get pulled in and like them more? And is the reverse true? Do you think that board gamers, like your friend you described, who paints all of his board gaming stuff, will they kind of think, well, now that I've painted so many things, that wasn't so bad, maybe I could try one of these crazy miniature games?
I think you'll see elements of it in both directions, because you gotta go back to our experience in miniature gaming, Russ. Like, how many people came into that little tiny store of yours and played games with miniatures from a hobby company, but never ever put a single piece of paint on it, and could barely be bothered to prime half their models, and sometimes couldn't even be bothered to glue their guns on, and would tell you at the start of the game, hey, all these guys are equipped with rail guns. I need you to remember that they all have rail guns. It's going to depend on the individual and how involved they are in their own hobby, and what part of that game or hobby that they're really, really passionate about. Yeah. I can't even think of a time that I would even feel like I'd probably break into like cold sweats putting miniatures on a table that weren't like fully painted, based, have protective coats on them, and ready to go. But I have plenty of friends that are happy to show up at my house with, goblins with their spears like falling off, and they have just as much fun.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And I think it's down to the individual, isn't it? Like, what do the people want? And I think, going back to your question, it's some people will go from a board game to a miniature game, and that'll be an easy transition. Some people go from a board game to a miniature game, and that'll be and some will never move, because that's just not what gets them excited, and it doesn't do it for them.
Right. I think the miniatures are also just a part of that. I think it's much easier to go from a miniatures game and then see the cool miniatures in a board game and go to the board game, because it's a more restrictive environment, which might or might not appeal to someone psychologically, but it's not more difficult to wrap your head around. But to go from a board game with cool miniatures to a miniature game, the abstractions are much more abstract. That damn zombie again. And you're like, now all of a sudden you're measuring with a ruler, and the rule book is, as we've said, goes from 20 pages to 450 pages and is a giant brick. Right. So I think there's a I think as a gateway game for bringing miniature gamers into board games, I think they probably will work better and will have more success than vice versa, simply because of the fact that those miniatures that you may love to paint as a board gamer and you got into them and now you're looking at mini games is just one element of that transition that I think in my head, and probably because I don't know, because I started with mini games, maybe I think they're more complicated, which doesn't make any sense. But in my head, it just seems more along the lines of the flow would be more easy in one direction than another, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, this might be a tangent for this topic, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway because we seem to be okay with that.
We are.
I find myself playing more board games with great miniatures right now, but it's not because I get excited about the great miniatures or that it's a board game. It's that they fit into my life easier.
That's very true.
I can play a game of Sedition Wars with my buddies on a Friday night after my 2-year-old finally goes to sleep, and we can be done. Like you play that game, and you could be done, and you can have a really, really good time. When getting together with my buddies to play a game of Warhammer 40,000, it was an all-day affair. Like we'd pack up our miniatures, we'd go to a game store, we'd play games, and our wives would call themselves Games Workshop widows because they wouldn't see us for a whole day. Right. But the board games fit my current lifestyle way better.
That makes a lot of sense, and I agree.
Yeah, I found the same thing. The board games definitely give you that. You have that more flexibility of where you can use them. Just get them to the table. It's just easier.
Yeah, I think you'll see people doing both, and I still love putting a big army out onto the table and playing the game, but that time is much more precious for me, and I have to plan that out a lot more in advance.
Right.
Very good. Well, any other thoughts on this topic of board game, miniature game mergers?
I like it, and I'm glad of it, and I hope I see more of it.
Yeah, I'd like to see more of it, and I'd like to see one with tentacles, some Martians possibly, and maybe if they could add scantily clad women to that as well, that'd be great.
Oh, you can't have too many of those. So, Drew...
Well, wait, I do have one, actually, that I've been meaning to pop in here, because going with what you were saying, Russ, about getting spoiled, I think we are being spoiled, and I think an excellent proof of the fact that we're spoiled is everybody's reaction, or at least locally everybody's reaction to Privateer Press's Level 7.
Right.
So, I mean, everybody saw that Privateer Press, a company that's well known for miniatures, is going to have a board game. Everybody got excited. Oh, it's going to be sci-fi. I mean, and it's been bandied about for years, so everybody got plenty of time to get all excited about it. And then when it comes out, it's cardboard chits, right? And I know that you were disappointed, Russ.
I was very disappointed in that because I figured that, it's Privateer Press. Of course they'll have cool models. And so the mechanics were fun. I played it. The bits didn't appeal to me. Apparently it's selling very well. I think the first print one's almost gone. But I didn't, I was hoping for more. I was hoping for something like Grind where you'd have lots of cool alien models and all kinds of cool stuff.
And I mean, speaking for myself, we were signed up to do that. That game demo, and you signed me up for that, and I was excited about it. But when I found out there were no minis, I decided to sleep in.
We're done, right?
So, I mean, literally, the mechanics, and that's, I think, and again, maybe because I'm coming from a mini game background, but I don't want to be pushing little cardboard tokens or little stand-up cutouts around on a board. I want those 3D, like cogs, the cogs from what's that? What was that game? Gears of War, yeah. They, the models there were awesome. That made that game, a really cool space hulky, to go back to the origin story there, experience, as opposed to, in my head, it's much more of an abstract intellectual exercise when you're just moving the little chits around. And Robo Rally, another excellent example. I hate Robo Rally.
Yeah, there are miniatures for that, though.
But there are miniatures, exactly.
Well, I agree completely, and I think... it's not only that, I think it's tough both ways being spoiled, because not only is it that, Privateer is a miniature company, so we expect miniatures from them, but also it's hard. I think it's harder now in the age of the Fantasy Flight, blinged out box and Zombie Side and everything else, even for a pure board game to come out without, that level of production quality.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, hey, what was the last board game that you really enjoyed that had no 3D miniature bling to it?
Lords of Waterdeep.
Lords, yeah. Well, yeah, but then what do you do? What did you do? What did we both do?
I bought the D&D polls, but I would still like it without the D&D polls.
I know the D&D polls. Yeah, I totally forgot about Lords of Waterdeep, but I was thinking more along the lines of Small World.
That's true. Small World,
which was chit driven also. But yeah, so I mean, it's not like there's a lot of. If I look at my collection, it's almost all board games that have really cool miniatures as part of them.
Yeah, except for Zuluretto, a couple examples, but mostly you're right. Mostly bling. I am attracted to the bling. Drew, is your board game collection the same way? Mostly.
Yeah, I was trying to think of it. Exception of a few games that I play with my wife, like Carcassonne, Power Plant. They're all games that have miniatures involved, and even the ones that had kind of average subpar miniatures, I've just painted and added my own miniatures.
Yep.
So they're all miniatures. But again, I think that's primarily driven by what our passion is and what we are.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think you're right. Lots of Euro gamers that would tell you don't need all that stuff. But
that's what I was going to say. Does that mean we're Ameritrash gamers? I hate that term, but is that what they're referring to?
Means we have good taste. That's what it means.
I prefer that spin.
I think so. I mean, I just went to Historicon to promote Fantaside a couple months ago, and there was plenty of people there playing their chit games, and they were so passionate about their chit games and spent a lot of time looking down at us miniature gamers. Why are we bothering spending a lot of time doing those miniatures? We could be pushing chits around.
Right. There's a lot of ASL guys out there that would tell us that A, our game is far too simple, and B, you're wasting all the time with those plastic pieces.
Yeah, exactly. They're really passionate about that hobby and what they do and what it represents. Yeah. It doesn't appeal to me, but I spend lots and lots of time painting miniatures and dreaming about playing games with my friends, and a little bit of time playing games with my friends.
There you go.
So.
And I would say Drew's exactly right. It's where your passion lies, and I would say my passion is firmly fixed with the miniatures.
Right. Look at that noise. Well, that noise must mean it's time to go from Dunkin' Donuts. That
Dunkin' Donuts guy over there is starting to practice his American Idol audition. We should probably leave.
So, Drew,
and that's an impressive scowl that he has too. Like,
what can I? Nice.
Wow.
They always look at us.
They always give us a funny look. What can I buy you for one last donut before we go, Drew? What's your favorite?
I'm gonna have that new pumpkin one.
Good choice.
Really?
Are they out again?
Pumpkin?
Have you had the pumpkin muffin?
Not a big fan of pumpkin.
Oh, the pumpkin muffin at Dunkin' Donuts is to die for. I'm just saying.
Oh, I'm going with the donut. Like, I want to do that pumpkin donut right there with
muffin.
Like, I don't know what that icing is, but I'm gonna try it.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. All right, I'll get you one of those. All right.
All righty.
Well, Drew, thanks so much for joining us here in the Lost Chapters, and we look forward to chatting you more in the main show.
Yeah.
Sounds
thanks,
great.
Drew. It was nice talking to you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for purchasing a D6G Lost Chapter. Supporting the show helps it grow.
Listen, gamers, to a story that was written minutes ago. I don't know what the rest. I haven't written the rest yet.
Good.